In 1955, William Rowe was hiking on Mica Mountain in British Columbia when he encountered something he couldn't explain. Rowe was an experienced hunter. Initially, when he saw the large creature ahead of him on the trail, he thought it was a grizzly bear. Then, it stood. At 6 feet tall, the strange humanoid figure had brown and silver fur, and upon closer inspection, Rowe discerned that it was female. In his words, its arms were much thicker than a man's arms, and longer, reaching almost to its knees. Its feet were broader proportionally than a man's, about 5 inches wide at the front and tapering to much thinner heels. When it walked, it placed the heel of its foot down first, and I could see the gray-brown skin or hide on the soles of its feet. The head was higher at the back than at the front, the nose was broad and flat, the lips and chins protruded farther than its nose. But the hair that covered it, leaving bare only the parts of its face around the mouth, nose, and ears, made it resemble an animal as much as a human. By this description, someone today would easily recognize this as Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. But what you might not know is that Rowe's account is actually the first to describe the Sasquatch as an ape-like creature. The origins of the Bigfoot legend might surprise you. It's a story that gets to the complexity of popular folklore and how numerous sources of inspiration can contribute to the creation of a cultural icon. I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. What surprised me when I started researching this topic is that the origins of Bigfoot can actually be traced to Canada. This will probably be true for many of you, but I always thought the story started in the Pacific Northwest, but it turns out that's not the case. The Pacific Northwest of the United States is a hotbed for Bigfoot folklore, and we'll get into where this idea came from later in this episode. But the earliest accounts of the Sasquatch come from the other side of the border in British Columbia. In the 1920s, a man named John W. Burns recorded stories of a creature called Sasquatch. Burns was a school teacher in the Chehalis Indian Reserve in the Fraser Valley, which was close to the town of Harrison Hot Springs. Remember that town, it'll be important later. And the stories that Burns recorded were very different from the Sasquatch described later by William Rowe. In his account, members of the Chehalis Nation described a tribe of hairy giants. They looked like humans, and while they otherwise lived apart from actual humans, they lived in villages, they wore clothing, and they carried weapons. These creatures were magical beings, and they fit into the wild man archetype that you see in folklore all over the world. For example, in early medieval Europe, especially in England, you had stories of wild men, woodwoses, fauns, people, creatures who were not quite human, not quite divine. So, stories of the Sasquatch percolated in the Fraser Valley such that by the 1950s, people outside of the indigenous community had knowledge of this legend. Remember the town of Harrison Hot Springs, near William Rowe's encounter on Mica Mountain? In 1957, British Columbia was celebrating its centennial, and the provincial government was offering funds that local communities could use for celebratory projects. Harrison Hot Springs proposed a Sasquatch hunt. Their bid was rejected, but the Sasquatch proposal hit the news. Soon papers across Canada began publishing stories about the Sasquatch. It caught fire, and Harrison Hot Springs starts receiving a lot of Sasquatch tourism. The British Columbia Centennial Committee responded by offering a reward of $5,000 for anyone who could find and capture a Sasquatch, which today would be over $54,000. With news of the reward, as you can probably guess, alleged sightings started pouring in. And one of those sightings was from none other than William Rowe. He claimed that this happened to him in 1955, which was 2 years before the competition began. But as I mentioned earlier, Rowe's sighting was the first to describe the Sasquatch as an ape-like creature rather than a human. Why is this significant? Well, it started a trend. Many later sightings would mirror Rowe's account. It was Rowe's description that would define the Sasquatch or Bigfoot in our popular folklore today. It's also interesting that despite this, we don't know much about William Rowe. After submitting his account, he kind of falls off the map a little bit. He moved away from Harrison Hot Springs, and it doesn't appear that he was ever interrogated or at least interviewed before he died. But the story of the Sasquatch was understandably hard to contain, and so within a few months, it spread to the United States. And in 1958, workers at road construction sites around Bluff Creek, California, began finding footprints. Very large footprints. So large that one construction worker named Jerry Crew decided to cast one of the prints in plaster. That way it could be saved and studied later. Like William Rowe's account, the story of the large foot was covered in the news. And with his American debut, Sasquatch got a new name: Bigfoot. But over time, a curious pattern emerged. These footprints kept showing up on construction sites around Bluff Creek. All of these sites were run by the same contractor, Raymond Wallace. After Wallace died in 2002, his family came forward with these strap-on wooden feet that he would use to create these prints. He did this all throughout Northern California, and he took great pleasure in pranking his employees. When he passed away, his son said Ray L. Wallace was Bigfoot. The reality is, Bigfoot just died. But alleged Bigfoot sightings continued, and Bigfoot has become a folkloric hero in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. And despite William Rowe's initial description of a female Sasquatch, Bigfoot is usually described as a male creature. Bluff Creek, California would later become the location of arguably the most famous Bigfoot sighting. Filmed by the cowboys Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin on October 20th, 1967. Their recording shows a female Bigfoot that exactly matches William Rowe's account from 1955. Patterson had actually written about Rowe's experience prior to making this film, so he was aware of Rowe's description beforehand. Most anthropologists believe the film to be fake, with some, like John Napier, arguing that it is clearly a person in a gorilla suit. But some, such as Grover Krantz, have argued that a person could not imitate those movements. Krantz claimed the size and shape cannot be duplicated by a man. Its weight and movements correspond with each other and equally rule out a human subject. Its anatomical details are just too good. But critics of the Roger Patterson film point out that Roger Patterson was a known swindler, with a documented habit of ripping off even family and friends. He set off with the explicit goal of recording a Bigfoot and just so happened to achieve his goal. But regardless of these debates, it was already too late. Bigfoot took on a life of his own. Bigfoot hunters in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest tried to attach Bigfoot to Native American legends of ogres that are popular within the region. Though these ogres don't really resemble the later Bigfoot folklore, really I think the credit has to go to the Chehalis Nation in Canada. Whether or not you are a Bigfoot believer, what this story really demonstrates is the shift in popular folklore that occurred during the 20th century. Prior to the 1900s, supernatural folklore really revolved around spirit entities, think fairies, ghosts, etc., that were accepted as part of a mystical, let's say, inspirited landscape. And while those legends still remain, especially ghost stories, what you see, especially in the West after the World Wars, is the shift in folklore to cryptozoology, which seeks to study and expose legendary animals like Sasquatch or other biological creatures like aliens. And what's really at work here is this new desire to prove the biological reality of folkloric creatures, with goals of catching and examining them as a scientist would in a lab. This is a huge contrast to folklore from previous eras, which focused on supernatural or magical events. I started Fireside Fables because as a writer, I have always been fascinated with folklore and storytelling. Storytelling is, to me, at the very heart of what it means to be human, to create and invent and build community beyond our needs for survival. And Lord knows we will literally never run out of stories to explore. So if you'd like to join me on this journey, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed and maybe even told a friend or two. Be well, and I'll see you next time.